Hello, YouTube. This is UMOZO3. So now we're on to lesson 40 in the Python curriculum, and this is going to be our last lesson on object-oriented programming, and I'm only expecting about 4 more lessons beyond this. But anyway, last lesson we got cut a little bit short talking about class methods and static methods. So we're going to be talking about all of that in a lot more detail. But I also want to talk about getter and setter methods, basically properties. And then we're also going to go ahead and review object-oriented programming as much as the 20 minutes allows. So what we're going to do is go ahead and review class and static methods. So remember, we're building up this person class. This is going to be the 8th lesson, or at least we started on lesson 33, right? And then we had 1 or 2 lessons about the point class, but it's mostly been about this person class. Okay, and so we have these class variables, and 2 of them are public variables that you can totally access and call out without, that you can call outside of the class. And then this is a weekly private instance variable. And we said that you're discouraged from calling weekly private instance variables from outside of the class, but you're not technically prohibited from doing it as far as computer programming goes. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then this is a constructor, which is responsible for assigning the instance variables name and age to the values P and Q that are passed in by the programmer, right? So this would be responsible for creating an instance of a class. Okay, and then we also, from previous lessons, we've also had the work function where we go ahead and print something on the console and we increment the value of the instance variable for that particular instance by 10,000. But we said that has no effect on the instance variable for other instances that you don't call it on, or for the general class variable. It doesn't change that either. It only changes the instance variable for the instance that you called it on. There's also speak and fly functions. So we've seen this since lesson 38, I think, when we were talking about whether or not a particular instance can speak, whether or not a particular instance can fly. Okay, and so what we can do is we can have functions that will not only modify the values of those instance variables for all instances, and we would call those class methods if they're going to modify class variables that apply to all instances, but we could also have similar methods that would just change the value of one of those instance variables for just one of the instances. So what if you just wanted, one person to be able to speak, but no one else? But anyway, we've seen examples of these functions, and then we also have dunders. So again, we have less than and greater than, and we can tell Python what it means when we want to go ahead and compare one instance of the person class directly against another instance of the person class. And the get item dunder allows us to basically treat the instance of the class as though it's a dictionary that we can reference values from. So you plug in a key and you get a value out. And so we can specify what that's going to be. And remember, we can go ahead and basically allow the get item function to return a strongly private instance variable. Okay, it's just the fact that you can only directly call or reference a private instance variable, a strongly private instance variable, from inside of the class. So since we're inside of the class, it's no problem to return self.age. But remember, if we try going down here, if we try printing a dot underscore underscore age, there was a problem with that in the previous video. And we said that the resolution to that is to go ahead and call on the dunder, to call on the get item dunder, and to get a of age instead. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then there's also a string representation of an instance of the person class. We print their name, and then is, and then the string representation of their age, and then years old. A class method is a method that's called on the class itself, usually, rather than on particular instances, although it can. And we said basically there's 2 uses of a class method, and one of them, basically a factory method, is a class method that creates a new instance of a class with particular parameters. And we said that, like with instance methods, how you have to have self be the first argument in all the parentheses to indicate to Python that you're talking about an instance method. With a class method, you have to have something like CLS in the top of the at the beginning of the parentheses, right? And so that would mean that you're trying to that would signal to Python that you have a class method. So that would mean that you're either usually going to change the value of a class variable. Okay, so that's what we're saying here. Or you could go ahead and call on the constructor for the class. Okay, so we're going to see examples of that. Remember, if we scroll down here, this is an example of a factory method. So it's a class method that's responsible for creating an instance of a class. Okay, and so what it does is it has CLS as the first thing in the parentheses. But again, that's not an argument. It's basically just a symbol to Python that it's a class method. And then you have P, so you just accept one input. So let's figure out what happens with P. what we do is we return CLS of P and 20. So what this does is it calls on the constructor of the person class. So it's going to create a new instance. It's going to create a new example object with P being equal to P, with P being whatever parameter was passed in when the class method was called, and Q being equal to 20. So Q, here you can see the constructor, age was assigned to Q. So age was assigned to the second parameter that came in. So if you call class method with this constant 20 here, we know that we're going to get some 20-year-old. And then the question is, what's the name? And that's going to be whatever parameter, whatever one input is passed into this class method. So hopefully that makes sense to you. That's called a factory class method. And we said that class methods can also modify class variables. So then if you go ahead and scroll down to this one and you look at this silence everyone, again, you see CLS in the parentheses as the first thing. And so this is basically an example of a method where if you call it, it's a void method, it doesn't return anything, but it would change the value of the can't speak class variable. That would apply to the general class as well as any instances. So then if you called x.canSpeak or q.canSpeak or w.canSpeak for any instances, x, q, and w, you would see that none of them would be able to speak, because if you change the value of a class variable, it applies to all the instances as well. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then we also talked about static methods, and we said that static methods are also called on a class, and usually they operate a little bit more independently. Okay, so they're applied to a class, but they're independent standalone methods, and you don't put CLS in the parentheses. Okay, they don't really need to have anything in the parentheses at all. Okay, and they're called on a class. They still can modify class variables. You can still use them as factory functions. You can still use them as methods to create instances of the class. But more often than not, the convention is that we use static methods for independent functionality outside of the class. In the previous video, I briefly brought up an example of the math module. And I said basically a module is like a class that has functions in it, right? And so when we call math.square root, right, if we import the math module and we say print of math.square root of 81, or basically that's a static function. It's a call to a static method, which is written and defined inside of the math class, but we don't need to create any math instances, right? We don't need to create a math object in order to use a square root. We would just go ahead and call the class. We would say math.square root of 81. That's an independent standalone method, okay? So standalone purposes for outside of the class is typically how we use static methods, but they're very similar, okay? So both methods can change class variables. Both methods are called directly on the class. Okay, both methods can accept inputs or not, and both methods can either return something or not. And methods that don't return something would usually have the effect of either changing a variable, you know, a class variable, or printing something to the console, or potentially both. Okay, the differences are the decorator on top. So if we scroll down, usually class methods are denoted with @class method. Okay, and one of the things that we're missing here is that static methods are usually denoted with @static method. So I think I was missing that in the previous video, but that's something you want to remember. If you're looking at this static method, if you're trying to change the value of a class variable, with a static method, you need to call the name of the class. You'd say person.canFly equals true, and this would change the value of the canFly class variable. If you want to do that with a class method instead of a static method, you need to have CLS in the parentheses, and then you would say CLS.canSpeak. So this means that you're referring to the canSpeak variable of the particular class that you're looking at. So hopefully that's clear to you. And you could go ahead and change that to whatever you want. So with this class method, I changed canSpeak to false, even though it was initialized to true at the top of the class. And with the static method, I changed canFly to true, even though it was initialized to false at the top of the class, okay? Another difference is that a class method has CLS as the first thing in the parentheses, and a static method doesn't need any arguments, right? It doesn't need anything in the parentheses. If you want to create an instance with the person class with a class method, you would say return CLS of NA, right? For two inputs, N and A, right? And so we see that right here. We would create a 20-year-old with whatever name the programmer passed in for P. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then if you want to create an instance of a person class with a static method, you would just say return person of NA. You would just say return an instance of the person class, right? So here you're not really referring to the class within anymore. You're saying, oh, go get an instance of the person class wherever the person class is. And in this example, it happens to be in, you know, the class that we wrote it in. But anyway, hopefully you can understand the subtle difference here. Fundamentally, it's a little bit different what's going on here. And that's also applies to the methods that change the value of a class variable. This one says cls.can'tSpeak equals false. And then this static method here says person.canFly equals true. And you can understand the difference of the decorators. Are you talking about a class method where you need CLS in the parentheses, or a static method where you don't need anything in the parentheses? So hopefully that's clear. And then finally, we said that a class method can be run on a particular instance, but a static method cannot. So I want to show a few more examples. Remember, we created an instance of the person class called Abby with a, who's 42, and there was just a direct call to the constructor. And we said that we could call on the weekly private name instance variable, right? It just gives us a little Python enhancement proposal suggestion. But then if we try calling directly on the age instance variable, that's going to be an issue there. And then so we said, well, the way around that is to go ahead and use the dunder. So we've already seen this a couple times, but we're going to say a of age, right? And then this is going to be calling on the class method to create a new person called Patrick. Okay, so this would be a 20-year-old, right? This would be a 20-year-old named Patrick. And then remember, in the static method, we created a 25-year-old. So then if you go ahead and scroll up, you can remind yourself of that, right? So this creates a 20-year-old named 20-year-old, right? And then this one creates a 25-year-old. And the question is whether you're using a class method or a static method to do that. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then we can go ahead and print the 3 string representations of those 3 person objects, right? And those showed up on the console from the previous lesson, right? And then what we can do is we can go ahead and see whether we can, I guess this statement doesn't really have an effect, right? So we can try to print and see whether C is less than B and A is less than B. So that's using the less than dunder, and apparently that's false, right? And then again, this is an example of how you cannot print a strongly private instance variable from outside of the class. So again, it only runs the try code up to the point that there's an issue, and then it goes on to the attribute error exception block, okay? And then so what happens if we try to go ahead and say, what happens if we try to go ahead and call person.giveEveryoneWings or person.silenceEveryone? So basically this would be calling either the class method or the static method. So let's go ahead and see which is which. So then if we go ahead and say person.silenceEveryone, so then this is an example of a class method. So this is something, remember, class methods are particularly well suited to change the values of class variables. So let's go ahead and silence everyone. And then remember the give everyone wings. If you hover over that, remember it gives you a little bit of documentation here just by default. So it tells you that this is the static method. Okay, and if you hover over silence everyone, it shows you that that's the class method. Okay, so then if you say give everyone wings, that's a static method. And so both methods change the value of a class variable, but they do it in 2 slightly different ways. One of them says CLS dot, and the other one says person dot, right? But what we're going to do is we're going to see whether B can fly. So remember, B is an instance of the person class, and we want to say either B of name can fly or B of name cannot fly, okay? We're also going to try to get C to speak. And remember, if C is able to speak, they can say something like, yay, I can speak, right? But if you cannot speak, it throws an assertion error and it says this instance cannot speak. So we're going to see whether or not this line of code 151 is going to throw an exception. Okay, and then I'm just going to comment out this line of code, and then hopefully we can save the last 5 minutes for the last object-oriented topic that I wanted to talk about, right? But there's going to be an issue here, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix the syntax there, and we can run main.py, and you can see that there's going to be an assertion error, right? So it says this instance cannot speak. So suddenly we're no longer able to speak. So then we could go ahead and remove that, right? But then what happens if we go ahead and send one of the instances? So now let's go ahead and get the instance B to fly, because it seems like from this line of code, it says Patrick can fly. Because remember, according to person.giveEveryoneWings, this was a static method that we called, and it changed the value not only of the class variable, but also of the instance variable for all instances. So now if we go ahead and say b.fly, then we can go ahead and say I can fly, and that's the output that we said if we asserted self.canFly, right? Then we would print I can fly, and we would not have an assertion error, right? And then what we could do is we could say c.work. So what if we take c to work? Remember that the value of the income class variable was 0, right? And then we can try to print the value of the income instance variable for that particular instance. But again, this is an example of a weekly private instance variable. So then Python doesn't love that. And then same thing for the person class variable. So we can go ahead and compare those last two things. And so for the particular instance, income was increased by 10,000 to 10,000, but for the general class variable, it's still 0. So hopefully that makes sense to you within the context of everything that we've been talking about. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about getter and setter methods. So basically, with private instance variables, it is not conventional for us to access or change these values from outside of the class. Okay, so for example, age was a strongly private instance variable in our program, right? So outside of the program, we could not write something like print of x dot underscore underscore age, right? Or we could not say something like x dot underscore underscore age equals 22, right? Those would not be allowed because that's a strongly private instance variable. Okay, so in computer programming, it is good convention to have getter and setter methods. Okay, basically getter methods in Python are called properties, and we mark them with a property decorator. So let me show you what I mean by that. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to have basically a very short function called age. And you can say, isn't there an instance variable called age, right? So how would I know whether I'm talking about the age instance variable or this age function? But what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to indicate to Python that this is going to be a getter method. So basically this is going to be responsible for returning the age instance variable for a particular instance. Okay, so then this would enable me to return the value of a strongly private instance variable, which I otherwise wouldn't be able to do. Because remember, we were talking about needing to use the get item dunder if we wanted to return the value of a strongly private instance variable, but this would be another way to do it, is to use a property. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're now that we have basically this property, you need this property decorator just like you need a class method or a static method decorator. And so this is an instance method, right? We're going to want to get the age instance variable for a particular instance. So this is going to be an example of an instance method, unlike the class methods and static methods that we've been talking about in this video. But it's going to return the value of a strongly private instance variable. So now I want to go ahead and try this stuff out. We've already tested out all this example code. But now what I want to do is I want to basically say print of c.age. And then you can see that this is not going to be an issue. So now it's actually able to return the value of a strongly private instance variable, because by basically marking a method as a getter method, by basically giving it this property decorator, we're allowed to basically allow Python to distinguish between a getter method, which returns the value of a strongly private instance variable, and the strongly private instance variable itself. So this would allow us to do something that would otherwise be difficult to do if we're working with a strongly private instance variable. We can also talk about a setter method. So, strongly private instance variables are hard to get the values of, but certainly they're also hard to change the values of. So what we're going to do is we're also going to talk about a setter method. So like a getter method, which basically you're going to have this @property decorator, and that would allow you to return the value of a strongly private instance variable like we just talked about. You can also go ahead and modify the value of a strongly private instance variable. And the way that you would do that is you basically write so you write and then basically the variable name, so the strongly private instance variable name dot setter. And so basically you're indicating to Python that you want to go ahead and change the value of a private instance variable. And you want to be able to let that happen in a context outside of the class. So now what I would be able to do is I would be able to say for some person instance p.age equals 20. And then that would go ahead and indicate to Python to go ahead and reassign the value of that strongly private instance variable to 20. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do, remember, you can see that by making a property, by making a getter method, it's no longer a problem to directly call the value of that strongly private instance variable. But indeed, now I can change the value of that strongly private instance variable too. So this calls the setter method and this calls the property. So basically, by making a getter and a setter method, it's no problem to not only access values that are strongly private, but modify values that are strongly private. So now it's no problem to literally just say c.age equals 76, and then I could print the age of c, and then it's no problem to change the value. So hopefully that was interesting. That was the end of object-oriented. From you, Melissa 3. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.